I met Karen last summer at one of these PMI symposiums that the Youth Developed had. And we were at a workshop. She was one of the panel members, and diversity was one of the topics. And I approached her afterwards and said, well, would you be interested in speaking at this symposium? So 10 months later, here we have Karen Salomon today. And Karen is recognized by our clients for exceptional capacity to get things done, both within her own organization as well as with her clients and her clients' clients. Karen holds an impeccable record of successfully leading innovative global cross-functional efforts. She artfully implements realistic solutions that match the organization's current need and capacity in a manner that sets them up for continued growth. Please welcome Karen Salomon.
Hi, everybody. I like to do my little wave. Thanks for those great introductions. In the title, I already get a sense for, as Renee said, how many project managers are in the room. But I always like to get a bit of a feel for what the audience expects and is looking to get out of the session. So if you don't mind humoring me with a couple of questions, just raise your hand, that kind of thing. I saw there's a couple of French representatives in the room, so we have international diversity, French companies, French project managers, that kind of thing. How many of you guys are actively managing projects within your role? Multiple projects or just one? Multiple? Okay. I guess the other question was, how many of you guys came to the session because of the international or the diversity, global diversity kind of sense of the, okay. And how many of you guys kind of saw that multicultural mainstream and then thought, well, this might be relevant also within the United States or at home, or did that part resonate with anybody? Okay, so what I just wanted to ask of you is, I'm here for you guys. It's a privilege for me to be here and really just a blessing, because anybody who knows me, as Renee knows that one, I love to talk. So thank you. And two, I'm really passionate about what I do. In fact, my husband, who's in the room, was one of the first kind of comments when we started dating was, do you really have to love your job so much? Like, it gets irritating. But I do, I love it. And so I appreciate the opportunity to get to talk about what it is that I do. So today, we're going to go ahead and talk about diversity. And so just to give you an overview of some of the things that I hope to cover, what I ask of you is, if there's a specific topic that really catches your attention, you want to go more in detail, or you have questions about, then please join in, chime in, ask questions. Let's try to make this as interactive as possible, because it's hard for me coming into it to really know what the expected outcome and the broad range of topics and conversations that you might want to cover. So I'm assuming that if I start off at a really high level, try to cover all of the things that I think go into this very complex topic, then if there's something that any of you feel warrants further discussion or you have questions about, then please, I'm here for you. So I kind of challenge you to take some ownership in where we take today. The more interaction, and also something that you'll see, one of the things that I advocate is the humility to never presume that you know more than somebody else. So I'm not here presuming to know more about the topic than any of you, and especially not than all of us collectively. What I hope to gain is some really interesting discussion around some of the things that are encompassed by the topic of managing projects globally. And so before I get ahead of myself, what we're going to talk about and how I tried to kind of frame the conversation was first to talk about how diversity has been perceived through our industry and through industries in general, across industries. And I kind of labeled that diversity 1.0 and 2.0. I heard this recently at some diversity conferences, and I thought it was dead on, especially because now they're really talking about diversity 3.0 and what that means. And that's where the whole multicultural mainstream kind of comes into play. And from there, you'll see it becomes relevant to talk about culture and what is really culture with reference to diversity. What is this multicultural mainstream, and how it leads to looking at diversity in the latest and most forward-looking manner. And then I was hoping to then kind of transition into how do we relate that into our world, the project manager's world, and then Karen's kind of view of things and what has helped me through my career to successfully lead projects. And so I don't want to get caught up in the wordsmithing, methodology, process. You know, you have the PIM book, and it's not a methodology. So I want us today, and I challenge you also, for my sake, to not get stuck in the wordsmithing of definitions of things, but really just talk about the broader concepts. I hope to have time, if I manage the agenda correctly, for us to have an exercise. I always think that not only that helps apply some of the things that we talk about and helps us remember, but I always valued in these events the networking opportunity. So to be able to spend 5 or 10 minutes meeting the people around you, 5, 6 people, I think for me that's been one of the greatest takeaways for any of the PMI events that I've attended. I always tell people, and I was in a panel discussion 2 years ago on careers and international projects, and you know, I hear it all the time. The time to network is not when you're looking for a job, right? So really, again, I challenge you, utilize this space. You've all come here because you have a similar interest. Take some time to talk to each other during, you know, this forum, but also after, if you get a chance. Exchange cards from somebody. And it's never the same if you get an invitation from LinkedIn from somebody that kind of does what you do and you're like, okay, I can see why they're reaching out, to somebody that you met last week or last night, depending on how proactive you guys are. And you have that face to the name, you know, so that's kind of my perspective coming into this. So just to follow up a little bit on the who am I, I really, again, want to come at this not presuming to have the answers to anything. What I bring is my practical experience, and I hope that I look young, because I am young. So I'm proud of the fact that I do have a really successful track record in fixing projects. I guess the best way to describe it is I didn't really look for the profession found me. How many of you guys feel that way kind of in the room? I saw some heads nodding. And I also, actually, to that, today I kind of get the sense that project managers don't like to label themselves project managers. There's kind of I don't know if it's ambiguity or as to what it really means to be a project manager. And there's some tension as to, I do a lot more than just the managing of the project. There's so much leadership that goes into it that a lot of us feel that the title itself tends to not really do justice to the role. So I've probably fallen in that error or that perspective myself. But one of the things that I really learned through my career was I never considered myself the project manager. I never had the title of project manager. But I always seem to put myself in leadership positions. And I'm stubborn by nature. I'm of German descent. And then I'm from Colombia, South America. So I know how to hustle. So, and I was just talking to Renee, I'll bend the rules, I'll push the rules, I'll question the rules, then I'll ignore the rules, and then I'll beg for forgiveness. So, and we'll talk about that and the whole, you know, background and culture and knowing yourself as it relates to managing your projects. But basically, you know, all I have to what I'm going to present to you is really the fact that I have seen it work time and time and time again. And as I found myself following these steps and following this philosophy and creating what became for me my methodology, I realized that there were consistent things that I was doing project after project. And I see some people nodding, because you start to realize what it is that works for you. And then I realized as I was training other people and as I was training my clients to then serve their markets, that there are consistent things and consistent approaches. I also realized there's a lot of training around how to do business with specific cultures. So how to do business with Asians, and then we go and we examine the Asian culture and how they're more risk adverse and how, you know, their view on leadership and how they're paternistic, and we describe them as a culture, or the Germans, and so we profile, you know, the nationality. And I realized that I probably got placed in a lot of positions within projects simply because somebody assumed that because I was Colombian, that I would know how to do business in Latin America. Or I spoke Spanish, which that even alone was an accurate assumption. I grew up in England, so when I was put in my first project in Latin America, my Spanish was pretty bad. So although I'm not going to deny that the language helps, one of the things that I learned is it's not enough and it's not really about the language, and it can actually sometimes even act against you, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what I really did want to emphasize is I usually get called when projects are failing. And being young, my first job was consulting for banks. And so everybody else in my team had years of experience. They had retired from the banking profession, and therefore they were now consultants for the banking. And I would get the clients that were kind of like either just comparatively unimportant because of their size or their remote location, or just really frustrating because of the difference in culture, different in need, or a combination of the two. And you know, one thing leading after another, it always seemed to be the same pattern as to why projects were going wrong. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, so I'm gonna quickly move through the diversity 1.0 and diversity 2.0. And of course, please chime in if you have other thoughts and other ideas. But at a really high level, diversity 1.0 is, you know, most basic. We understand that there's a different market out there that's not ours. And it usually comes as an afterthought. We know how to do business in our market, and that's our day-to-day operations. And then somebody decides we want additional market growth, we want to enter that market, whether it's within our geographical boundaries or somewhere else, and then we design a specific strategy to go into that market or to address that culture. What I always see consistently in diversity 1.0 is the timing. I do my general business as step one, day to day. And then as an afterthought, I then go and look at the secondary market. And again, it doesn't have to be in another nation or in another geographic location. The US is a perfect example for that. I was looking at the Herbalife brochures. I'm an Herbalife freak. Anybody know what Herbalife is? Those nutritional supplements. And actually, surprised to see that they're very much still in a 1.0, maybe 2.0, because their brochures for African Americans just simply show it's the same content, but they just have African American people in the pictures. Or it's the same content, but they have Hispanics and they've translated it into Spanish. Does that make sense? And how many of you guys at some point in your career have heard or told or saw firsthand all those ads that went wrong because there was a literal language translation and it was just complete failure, a mess? Anybody know any off the top of their head? Yeah.
Chevrolet Nova.
Yeah.
I saw in Mexico as a Nova.
Right.
Go.
That's a great example. So sometimes even in the language, we do a literal translation and the meaning or the implication in a different culture, and even the literal translation is exactly what we don't want to represent our product as. So the car, for everybody, you know, in Spanish, it means does not go, it doesn't work, it doesn't function. And that's the name of the car. And they launched it in Mexico with the same name. So who wants to buy a car that is called, it won't go, right? So other characteristics, separate budgets. And this is great. It doesn't necessarily mean that the money comes entirely out of, you know, a different source, but different buckets. So I kind of relate it to the quality movement. Remember when the quality movement, you had a quality team, and the quality team was in charge of quality. And they would have a budget, and they were responsible for the quality of the products that the company produced, right? Anybody remember that? There are some heads nodding. Well, this is kind of similar. A client that I worked with as recent as last year had created a team to address diversity and different diversities. They had created one for the Hispanics because in the United States that's a broad enough bucket, and that was an entire separate team with entirely, you know, separately allocated funds, and with those funds they had to, you know, feed or source all of their operations, not just the sales or the marketing. And there was different expertise, you know, so an alienated group of people, a specific group of experts are labeled the quality team, or, you know, the Hispanic team, or the diversity or the global marketing team. And that is our expertise. Our expertise is global cultures, or, you know, the Hispanic cultures, a lot of social background into this. And diversity is categorized primarily by race and by language, and also by geographic. So typically a country, you know, Germany, then they speak German, and this is the German culture. In 2.0, we begin to be less black and white. So what's critical for this is now the timing is in parallel. I do my current day business, and as I do my current day business, I know that I want to be in this additional market. So as I prepare my marketing campaign, I don't prepare my marketing campaign for the mainstream, let's say, white American, and then as an afterthought send it off to the Hispanic team for them to translate. But the marketing team in parallel creates a campaign for the mainstream white American and for the Hispanic. So the timing is parallel, but there's still two separate approaches. Does that make sense? What begins to happen is that the budgets are less separate. It's now the marketing team. And the expertise is less separate because now they're both marketing experts that are putting together a marketing campaign. There tend to be a difference in focus in that the mainstream ones will be very knowledgeable in how to cater to the mainstream white American market, and then harder to find marketing resources that specialize in the Hispanic market. And then diversity, and this is where it begins to get interesting, diversity now we acknowledge, sometimes through mistakes, huge mistakes, that it's not just about race or languages, but that there's something called culture, and even in language there's different meanings to words. And so we enter this realm of really trying to understand the people in that segment and that market that we're trying to cater to. So important thing, timing is in parallel, and at the same time we begin to see this broader, more in-depth understanding of culture. So since we touch on culture, to me this is where we really begin to dwell into just how complex this can get. So just a brief overview on culture, and there's a bunch of models out there, so I just picked one. At the end of at the higher level, they all say the same thing. But culture at the end is something that we have collectively agreed upon is acceptable. And we represent that visually in things that we can see in each other, like behavior and tangible things like the awards we give each other, the paychecks, bonuses, all that tangible stuff that we actually, can have access to, visual kind of tangible access to. So behaviors and artifacts. And then there's all these things that drive that underneath based on our values, our beliefs, and the norms that we create around those. So we, again, in phase 1 and maybe some of phase 2, group people into large groups and start to analyze some of this and start to, begin to determine, well, how would you deal with, or, how does a Japanese person behave different from a German person, from a French person, from a Colombian person? And so just to get a little bit accurate in some of the terms that I'm going to start expanding on, because I think this is where it gets really important. Artifacts, the physical manifestation. So, trophies, bonuses, when your name gets put up on a board, or employee of the month. Behaviors, these are all the patterns of activities that we do. It's how we treat our stakeholders, how we treat each other, how we focus our time, how we make decisions, how we use information and tools. These down here get to be really important and gray. And complex and harder to define, and which is why we get to this whole just multicultural mainstream. Because it used to be every country, very clearly as a nation has these values, does these things. Well, globalization has been happening throughout the world a lot faster than it's probably been happening in the US for obvious reasons. I'm an economic freak, so I think economics explains everything. And I like to have arguments with most people, depending on their profession, no philosophy but social sciences, human behavior. So you'll see me revert back to economics. But I believe that, because the U.S. economy wasn't as dependent on other economies within the world, we haven't really had to have that interaction, that interdependency, that trade. And geographically, we're separated from the rest of the world. But if you actually live outside countries of the U.S., especially if you live in South America, for example, it's interesting for me to see. Not every country, so I'll actually make a footnote here. I'm going to make a lot of generalizations. I'm going to stereotype a lot. I'm going to speak politically incorrect. Because I have to. There's no other way to talk about a topic than at some point, begin to talk in general terms and make some assumptions. My understanding is, of course, there's exceptions to every one of those comments. And the reality of that is hitting us more and more. But bear with me and give me some leniency when I make these broad comments. But in Latin America, it's very interesting to see that people are extremely aware of what happens in the U.S. economy. And certainly I think no one here would deny most of the rest of the world speaks English as a second language. And it's taught, there's a lot of bilingual schools from the beginning. And this isn't recent. It's been going on for a long time because there's a dependency between countries to trade and to do business and from one economy to the other. And so, we're just kind of guided that way. In the U.S., we've kind of been sheltered from that to a greater extent. And it hasn't been until more recent times that we've said, okay, to grow further as a nation, we're going to have to face some of these dependencies. And internally, we're beginning to live this diversity given all the migration that's coming into our nation. So I believe that this has gone on faster in other places of the world and at a slow, actually faster, it started sooner, but the rate has been slower. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of hitting us all at once in the U.S. and it's going, the rate of growth of most of these movements is happening really fast here within the U.S. And underneath, what we don't see that drives all these changes are norms and values and underlying assumptions. Now, it doesn't work just in one direction. It's kind of like a circular thing. Behaviors then reaffirm our values and turn them into beliefs. So what happens is, I have an assumption. I assume, for example, that not screaming at somebody is a good thing. And I have that assumption also based on my experience, because the more I behave that way, the more that I've been positively, reinforced by my parents and then by my coworkers that that's an acceptable way to act. So that behavior and the reinforcement that I get now validates that assumption and turns it into this value belief where now I don't even really rationalize it. I'm not aware that I'm making that association. It becomes like a truth to me. And then I take real ownership of it, and it's part of my core value system. This is constant and this is fluid. There are a lot of values and beliefs and assumptions that change throughout our lifetime, but it's a gradual thing. It's not a one day I decided. From a change management perspective, you know that one of the best practices is be careful how much you attempt to change a value or a belief. And when you're working at changing behaviors, try to understand that it's not a behavior you're trying to change in a manner that contradicts a core value of that company or of that individual. An example, I had a client that is a non-for-profit and has very strong beliefs in God and has a position in God, and everybody that works there is of the same faith. So asking them to become an organization that with values and behaviors that oppose that core belief in God would have been a losing battle, right? It would have really meant go change the workforce and really kind of create a new organization, because in essence that's what you're doing. Good luck trying to tell somebody to act against a value as deep as that one. So culture begins to be what we spend our time on, what we focus our time on. Now, it gets interesting within the U.S. when we realize that 86% of growth between 2000 and 2010 was from Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians. 86% of growth. And these are just stats. There's so many stats out there, so I just borrow them from many of the presentations that the marketing leaderships of great companies. This one comes from General Mills. So the VP of Marketing of General Mills was doing a presentation and also highlighted, they're expected to drive 71% of growth from 2010 to 2012. So it's not just the past growth rate, it's the future growth rate. Some additional stats here. If this is the white traditional American growth rate and you see it stagnating inside the US, then this is the non-traditional, and it begins to spike and to escalate. So minorities are definitely, growing at an exponentially higher rate than the mainstream, what we used to consider mainstream white Americans. So what does this mean? I mean, US companies, you can see them, they're struggling to enter all these marketplaces, and they're beginning to realize that putting black people in the picture or in the ad just doesn't cut it. In fact, it can be seen as an insult, and that translating the language can have exactly the opposite effect. So they're going into this whole cultural thing and trying to understand it, and you think it's easy. You think, oh, okay, you know, Latinos, I got them figured out, you know, family-centered and whatever other, you know, notions you have. And they're beginning to realize, you can go to the U.S. Census to get some more of the stats, and I encourage you to do so. You begin to realize you can't even bucket people into, well, they're just Latin. Even within the U.S., best practices are beginning to show, and this is from Geoscape, a company that specializes in dissecting and researching data to this degree, that even when we talk about Hispanics, you have categories, and trust me, there's more categories than this, but just at that second level, you can talk about, you know, are they first generation? Are they second generation? Do they speak English? Are they bilingual? Do they only speak Spanish? Do they only speak English? And so they've started to categorize them by that. How much time have they been in the U.S.? And what language do they speak? And with that comes how acclimated are they to the U.S. culture, which in and of itself is kind of like, what is the U.S. culture? But you've all been around people that kind of stick to themselves, not just Hispanics, but you know, they stick with their home language, not necessarily talk amongst themselves in English. So they're beginning to do very in-depth analysis of this to understand what are the behaviors, the patterns, the trend, and of course, how do we sell to these people? From my perspective, I'm an operational consultant. I always tell companies, you know, getting them in the door, that's a given, especially right now because it's growth driven by population growth. So it's not like you're going in there to cut into somebody else's market share. There is more market. The people are there. They want the services. What are you going to do with them when they come in the door? It's serving them. It's knowing how to work with them. It's knowing how to provide a sustainable quality experience with, you know, whatever it is that you're offering them. And it's not failing on that promise because we all know it costs at least 5 times more to get a customer than to keep one. So once you got it in the door, then we're talking, you know, expensive. So a friend of mine always says, you know, before you invite people to dinner, set the table, or you know what you're going to offer them for dinner. Go do grocery shopping. So from my operational perspective, this is huge, not just in knowing how to produce the sales ad, but operationally, how do we work? And these are not just customers. This is the labor force. This is the workforce. So again, in that symposium 2 years ago about, you know, working in global projects and how to get into the industry, and what do you do if you don't have experience globally? Or what do you do if you just don't have a profile like mine, or like, you know, so many others that are even more international, multicultural, because you didn't grow up in a different country, or you don't speak another language natively? What do you do? And my point of view on that was, you are already living and managing cross-cultural projects, even within your current environment. Even if you are a white American that only speaks English, begin to analyze how many people of other races or other ethnicities or other languages you interact with every day. So this is a reality, and it's a reality operationally. What do they do with this information? Well, you know, biculturals tend to be younger. Why do we care again? Because we want to sell to them. So bicultural millennials, they watch less TV, but they watch more English TV. So in general, they watch less TV, but when they watch it, it tends to be in English. There was another one about, you know, they access technology the same amount, but they do it through their phones instead of through computers. So all this kind of thing that gives us insight into how do we now relate to that group. So Diversity 3.0 is about understanding that the future is here and that we are a global kind of people. And we're almost at a point where it's individualism, you know, to the nth degree. Because on top of ethnicity and on top of race and on top of language and on top of culture, which really encompasses all of that, what's another topic of diversity that gets talked about a lot? So not race. So for example, there's gender, but, sorry? Gender. There's gender. That's the one. I wasn't thinking of that one, but that one came to mind. Age, right? So I hear age a lot across organizations nowadays. So there's also, you know, diversity in age. And there's that talk of the millennials versus, you know, the baby boomers, and what are their trends? What is their behavior like? Well, all of this matters a lot to us, and we'll talk a little bit of how this relates into the project management world. But the reality is that now it's upon us. Now we can't avoid it, or, you know, we can't just treat it as an additional nice to have, or just as a global project. It's in any project that you're going to have to deal with diversity. The globalization, or having the person be at a different location, those are all additional challenges when you're not face-to-face with someone. But I don't think that one is related to the other. If there were two white Americans and one was in a different location, you have the challenge of not being face-to-face. Then you have the challenge of being of a different culture, whatever that is, because of your age, because of your gender, because of your race, because of your subculture. You know, we can live in the same city and be of completely different cultures and have a really hard time working together. So 3.0 is great. It's really about strategizing. It's about being proactive, and it's about really just assuming the reality that we cannot avoid diversity. It is implied in everything we do. And therefore, we must incorporate it in our strategy into everything we do. So it's about finding what's similar in the mainstream, more even than what's different. To find what's similar, you need to understand what's different. So it's not that one avoids the other. It's not that we don't care anymore about what are the specific interests that relate to the African American population, or to the Latin population, or to any one of these subgroups. But it's okay, I know all of that, but it would be really inefficient of me to try to address all of those separately. And there's so many of those now vivid, I can no longer say, I only want to go after this group, or I only want to go after the other. There's circumstances when you do that for strategy. You narrow down your focus. But in general, a company that's at Diversity 3.0 is one that says, we want to make ourselves relevant to all groups. And so what they start doing, and General Mills was giving an example on how they do this with the Cheerio commercials, in which they realized that the same values of teaching children how to count, and giving them education through the breakfast experience, where the parents are, you know, playing with the cereal and the kids are counting, was just as relevant for African Americans as it was for Latinos, as it was for, you know, white Americans. And it didn't really matter your income. I mean, which parent doesn't want to give their child education? And what a fun way to do it, to incorporate it into everyday life, and to do it through the experience of the breakfast cereal. So they realized that's a common theme. And then they thought, okay, which subculture relates to that value the most? And that's where the in-depth market studies of, okay, education is most important to African Americans. Not that it's not important to Latinos, or that it's not important to white Americans, but it's most important to African Americans. For some reason, African Americans have associated that the strongest correlation for their children to have a better future than them is education. And so what did General Mills do? They used the African American family for that commercial. But that commercial is shown everywhere for everybody. And it's now used as a you know, best example of how to do this. And why do we do this? We want to basically optimize the use of our resources. We want to see how far we can stretch what works for everybody. And then we realize it might not work for this other category, or this other group, or this other, you know, subgroup, and we'll deal with that as a kind of Diversity 2.0. Where, as we're planning our market strategy, we realize this works for everybody except this other really critical stakeholder that we also want to. Whoops. Sorry about that. So why is this so important to us? Well, it's really important because as project managers, we kind of exemplify what leadership's all about, right? What change is all about, what team dynamics are all about. Because think about it, we're asked to implement things which imply change to a company, right? And to a group of people. We're asked to do it with resources that don't necessarily report to us directly, or most of them don't report to us directly. A lot of them, really, we have no authority whatsoever and maybe don't even have a vested interest in the project. And we do so within matrix organizations where each different component of the project, we're working with different members, bringing in different experts. So I wish it was as easy as to just say, okay, you understand the culture of the person that you're working with, and therefore you're good to go. You know, I understand now that you are, you know, a Latino woman with a German background, so I know that you like it straight. I'm going to just be really direct with you and really transparent, and now I know how to communicate with you, and I know how to get things done. I know that you like to be left alone, and those kind of things. Great, I'm ready to go. Not really, because then you add all the different moving dynamics of what we're trying to accomplish. We're gonna go through a process of change, and anybody here familiar with, you know, the change management, right? Teaches us that change is predictable. There's a systematic way to deal with change. And what's the number one kind of thing that you get out of you know, change management? Resistance, right? People don't like change. And what are we doing as project managers? We're changing. And we have no authority, right? You know, somebody just kind of said, well, now you go and make this happen, and good luck. So we're change agents without necessarily a title of authority for doing so. So what we really end up doing and exemplifying is what we call informal leadership role, where we really have to lead people, and this is where I go to that term project manager, because those of us that love the profession and that are really proud of, you know, our accomplishments know that there's so much leadership that goes into it and very little management at the end of the day. I mean, the management's a given. I don't want to underplay the management. You've got to have your I's dotted and your T's in a row, and you've got to do the paperwork, and you've got to do the scheduling and that kind of stuff. But the art of project management is in the leadership behind it. How do I communicate with the people that, you know, contribute every single piece of what we're trying to accomplish? And if that's on a global perspective, where, you know, you're at a distance, or where there's a language barrier, or even if that's not the case, well, you know, I deal with a lot of technical resources that are really hard to communicate with. They almost just don't want to talk. And then a lot of them do speak a different language, and then I don't know if they want to pretend that they don't speak English, or they just don't want to speak to me, or, you know, I'm like, what's the deal? And then when they do speak English, I'm like, okay, I didn't really understand what you said, right? So I told you I was going to be non-politically correct. So you add all that to it, yeah.
I would suggest your belief that the technical people didn't want to talk is a cultural challenge, because technical people often want to talk. Mm-hmm. They just may not want to talk about what you want to talk about.
Exactly, right. And not in those terms. I relate to them because my background's in statistics, and my first job was trying to break statistical concepts to the end user. And I guess I was fortunate in that my boss was very well studied, very well versed, as academic as it gets in the field of statistics, which meant that he really was not interested in having a conversation with somebody in layman terms about statistics. Not only was he not interested, he found it against his values, because it would be inaccurate. So one of the things that I learned was being that bridge and being able to have conversations in layman terms as a project manager across cultures, and you'll see it in some of my tips, becomes for me a best practice. How do I say things without using the technical lingo or even the most complicated, you know, common language term? But just, and I hear this a lot, dumb it down. And I've kind of twisted it because nobody likes to hear that, on the implication of that. And I've had to train people on this, so if you're telling them dumb it down, you're not really teaching them the right humble approach to things, you know. So I found myself using a lot, you know, masteries and simplicity. But absolutely, you may have that approach, but the technical person is coming from a place where they want to speak in technical terms, and they don't have the patience for you that doesn't speak their language and doesn't understand all of the terms, and then your questions either, you know, are too broad or stupid, or just really show a lack of understanding for the accuracy of what they're trying to accomplish or what they're trying to communicate with you. So, absolutely. And I just use that as a broad example because we do have a lot of Indian resources and we have a lot of Asian resources now in our technical field. So the language also becomes a barrier. On top of the cultural barrier of we have different expertise and different interests on how to communicate with each other. So there's all kinds of models related to change. This is one that I built for a previous employer and have used repeatedly with clients. And it really talks about, the transition of change, that it happens not only at a professional or organizational level, but it happens at a personal level. So every person that is with you going through this experience of a different culture is also going through the different stages of change. And we don't like change. So there's a lot of resistance, there's a lot of just challenges to overcome. Some things make it easier and some things make it worse. And in general terms, the greater the unknown, the greater the resistance. So again, I hope you're beginning to see the theme of communication is really critical, and don't have to tell you all, to our success. But it becomes so much more of a challenge when you're dealing with people of a different culture, not necessarily even because of the language, but just how do we relate to each other. Then you got team dynamics. So you're assigned a new project and you have a new team and it's your direct team. You might be a program manager and have different PMs that report to you, or you might be the PM and you have different technical resources of different areas that report to you in an indirect relationship for the duration of the project. But more than likely, people are coming in and out of the project at different times. And there is also a known, studied, proven reality when we work in teams. And that is that we go through stages as we come together as people to work. And there's certain uncomfortableness to those stages, and they're unavoidable. So we hate change, and working with somebody new is a change, and we have to go through that growing experience of learning how to work with them. And from a really high level, the stages are orientation, which really is about why am I part of this team? And so you really want to try that point to understand your common goal. We're working together to achieve something. Stage 2 is then, okay, I understand why I'm here, but who are you? Like, initially it's, so happy, the honeymoon stage, new team, exciting, we're going to rule, just going to rock it. And then, the elbow room starts happening, and it's kind of like, well, I like to do things this way, and I didn't really like the way that you answered me, and we haven't really had enough of time together to understand how to talk to each other, so we start to not get along. And then it's not until we go through this stage and spend enough time together and address these concerns that we begin to say, okay, here are the rules of engagement. Here's how we're going to play in the sandbox. Here's how we're going to get things done. Here's how we're going to work together. And we start determining for ourselves what our culture as a team is going to be. What are those behaviors that we're going to find amongst ourselves or deem acceptable and unacceptable? And it's only once we've done that that we can truly say as a team we're now productive. Well, lucky you if you remain with the same team throughout your project. But like I said, people are in and out, and every member that leaves changes these dynamics and forces you to go back to stage 1. Now, depending if it's a team of 10 people and only one person leaves, then it may not be as disruptive as if it's a team of 10 people and 5 people leave. So the bigger the change in and out, the stronger that these dynamics will continue to go on. All of that makes our life harder. And how people react to change and dissatisfaction and all of this has to do with their culture and how they relate and talk to each other. So you can see the layer on top of the layer, and not just ethnicity, race, but also, their gender and their age. One of the things that I find myself asking clients a lot as I start working with them is technological questions. So things like, in your organization, do all employees have their own computer? Do they have laptops? Do they have Blackberries? Do they, depending on the project or the company, the kind of software that everybody has access to? Do hourly employees, can they log into the system when they're off-site? Because that to me is almost, it's become more of a driver rather than really getting a sense for the kind of the visible behaviors. Technology tends to tell me a lot about how empowered the workforce is, the type of leadership style that they like, the political dynamics, because information is power, and so I have seen a positive correlation. The more technically savvy an organization is, the more that they've kind of diversed into this diversity 3.0 and softer leadership and all this kind of stuff. So we're leaders as project managers. And at the end of the day, what we have to do is we have to match our leadership style to all of these moving variables. And I have to say that I think your ability to do this without following black and white rules as to what is the country, what is the, what is the gender, what is the nationality, what is the religion, the more flexible that you become at applying this on the job, in the moment, spur of the moment, where it becomes intuitive almost, which is, by the way, kind of how I got into this. I backed into this because I had to figure out what it was that I was doing in a way that was replicable. And, if I was going through it, many people were going through it. And sure enough, there's all this theory on all these things. It's just as project managers, I think we rarely give ourselves credit for all the things we're leading. I mean, companies usually hire a change agent, an organizational person to lead change, and then they hire, a marketing specialist. We have to do it all, and we have to know and we have to manage all those dynamics in one. So this is from 1 Minute Manager, Kim Blanchard, and I was fortunate enough to work with someone that was part of the creation of the books and the documentation of all of this. So I saw firsthand kind of what the intent behind it was. And in working with clients, a lot of people are familiar with situational leadership. Sometimes it gets misconstrued, and often there's a limited kind of perception on what is meant by situational leadership. So how many people here are familiar with situational leadership? Okay, so not that many, but enough. It basically talks about how you match your leadership style to the development stage of the individual. And as I explain it, you're going to see what the misconception is. And so it means when somebody's new on the job, so it doesn't matter, I consider myself a really capable person, but if I start in a new company, then having somebody show me how to enter my time is something that I appreciate. And if they sit next to me and do it with me, I appreciate it. So I appreciate the directive approach because it's something brand new to me. As I start to get the hang of it, I'd rather somebody just say, hey, if you have any questions, let me know. And maybe even, tap me and say, do you have questions? Did you remember to do this? Hey, it's Friday. Did you remember to enter your time? Because we do it weekly, that kind of thing. And we call that more of a coaching style. So it's not like I just leave you on your own. Then supporting, I leave you on your own, but I'm here. And I'm here if you need me. And I make you constantly aware that I'm here. A sport analogy is coaching. So I don't play golf, but I use the golf analogy. So for coaching and for supporting, the coach is somebody that actually just doesn't play anymore necessarily, but they've been there, done that. And so they can watch you and they can tell you, you need to turn your wrist a little bit more outward, or your feet are too close together, or you need to relax your hips, and they make sure that your position is correct. But they're not there doing it with you. They're more watching and kind of giving you pointers. The supporting style is just, hey, I know you got it. But just in case you need something, because I have more experience than I'm here. And then the delegating is, look, I know you got it, and you probably got it even more than I have by this point. You are the subject matter expert. I trust you to go do, and come to me if you have any questions. What's interesting about this, and let me ask, anybody know what the shortcomings is, or what the common misconception? How is this model usually kind of used in a limited manner? Anybody want to have a go? So we tend to think that this is situational by individual, and that's at the broadest level that we think. And let me back up for a minute. So it often gets introduced, what is your leadership style? And a leader will come in and will say, well, this is my leadership style. This is my management style. I'm directive. I'm this. I'm that. And this philosophy would tell you, well, then you're not a good leader, because for you to say that you have one leadership style means that you are not aware of the fact that different circumstances will call for different leadership styles. Then there's a person that says, well, it depends on the individual and where they are on this scale. Now, the most common misconception is to leave it at that. Yes, it depends on the individual, but it really depends on skill set and on activity, all the way down to every single task. So again, first day on the job, entering time, I appreciate somebody walking me through it. But first day on the job, would I really need somebody to tell me how to introduce myself to a client? Well, maybe not, because I've done it many times before, and I might appreciate more of a coaching and supporting style as to this is how we do it in this company, this is our, this is kind of more in line with our culture. What's also interesting is people are very sensitive about these boundaries. A friend of mine at a client's used the word bucking and related it to her teenager, and I think it's really relevant. Teenagers do this a lot. As you get more comfortable with something, as they grow up, they start asking for independence. So nobody likes to be over-directed. But then if they don't get what they need, they can't be productive. So it's really important for us to understand where those boundaries come and to be really receptive of the people we're working with in how they're letting us know, I got it, I don't appreciate you, coming down my back, or they're really open to the directiveness, or they're getting a little bit lost, so they need to go back. Because at the end of the day, our capability, our capacity as a team, as a project manager, will be a result of the style and the skill set or the development stage of the situation. And I say this because if I had to, in a nutshell, kind of say what has categorized my success as a consultant and as a project manager has been my innate or kind of just intuitive ability to do this. So where even when somebody came in as a consultant and wanted to prescribe what the absolute end goal was as a project manager, we have to deliver this end result. And you're so focused on that end result that you're not able to see that your organization is not there yet, that your team members are not there yet, that a different country and a different culture certainly isn't there and doesn't even have the capacity to see there yet. Your ability to baby step them through that process, it kind of sounds condescending even as you say it, but your ability to understand, if they're not ready for step 6, you got to go step 1 through 5. Even if it isn't the best practice, you want to get to best practice number 6. And Americans, we tend to do this a lot because we have a lot of cross-industry best practices. Then we deal with other cultures. And again, it's worked in my favor because American executives will just get frustrated beyond belief and not even want to participate in the project or in the dealings with that other culture, because they're used to being at level 6. And then the other culture starts thinking, but you're not understanding my needs. Like, I don't care what you do in the States. Here, that's not going to work. And the American position tends to be, but that is the best practice. That is how it should work. Well, yeah, and I can see that is how it should work, but they're not ready for that. An example in project management maturity. Right? How many of you are asked to manage projects with people that have a project management maturity of 0? So recently I helped an organization create a project management office. It was their 3rd failed attempt at creating a project management office. And when I went in there, on top of the political wars that we have to also negotiate, I realized that everybody was trying to implement a project management office at level 6. Beyond the scale of maturity, their first conversations were about what software should we use. And I put together a team of people from the different areas that were politically, at war. And I said to them, first challenge, mastery is in simplicity. So we're not going to talk in any project management terms because the organization that we're going to serve doesn't speak in project management terms. And 2, we're not going to talk about software. Because to me, software is about being efficient, automizing, and we'll see in team dynamics. And we can't be efficient if we're not even being effective. So let's work with what the organization is ready to listen to. Let's work with the fact that they are at a beginning stage, and let's introduce some concepts. So what we agreed is we're gonna create a project management structure and a workbook, all the material based off Excel. Now, for those of you that work with countries that are not cosmopolitan And you face that challenge. They're not as technically savvy, and if you go in there with your Microsoft Office project plan that has all these intricacies, they can't even open it on their computer, much less modify it. So that right off the bat has alienated some people. So methodology, a lot of communication models out there. You know that there's a message, you know that you're the one that's emitting the message, and you know that there's a receiver. And then Six Sigma, best practice for continuous improvement. So models, there's plenty of models out there, and we just looked at some for change management, for leadership, for communication, and for process improvement. My thing is, it doesn't matter. Pick any process. Again, I use this one, and I use the communication because it's so critical to our role. But the key is make sure that you own it. And that you own it is that you assume responsibility from beginning to end for the entire process happening. So it's not that my role ends here at implementation and I'm done, or that my role ends at managing the project, or that my role ends at emitting the message. No, I own all of it. I own the fact that there was no value in me telling you something if you didn't receive and absorb and almost to the point accept what I was trying to communicate. And the moment that I do that, I've really taken a huge challenge on, because I realize that it's no longer about just getting the words out there. I really now have to use a process such as this one to put a message out there and then test to see if what I put out there was received. And did you receive what my intention was? And this is something that's going to work regardless of language, regardless of culture. Get yourselves in the habit of putting messages out there and then testing whether they were received with the intention with which you communicated them. Even within English speaking, I have a close friend of mine that has seen my work now for several years, and he laughs. I don't do it anymore. Maybe I did today, but he was constantly telling me, every time I'd come back from a trip, I'd sit down and we'd talk about things like this, and he'd be like, Karen, I get it. I got it with the first sentence. Well, I'd probably come back from a trip of a different culture, a different language, and one of the things that I developed as a habit was to never say things just in one way. I really started to develop the ability to say the same thing in 3 ways, while feeling comfortable enough that all of the 3 versions were accurate enough to convey what I was trying to say, so I didn't feel like I was in somehow losing accuracy. And I would do it in a way that I didn't feel like I was dumbing it down. It almost just looked bad on my communication skills, and it obviously did, because my friend was like, okay, you could have just summarized that into your first sentence. But it was part of my methodology. Because even if you spoke English, I was now not taking for granted that you understood the deadline cannot be met under these premises or under these circumstances, and begin to explain why or what the choices are. Something I always challenge project managers: if you find a problem, that's a given of your job. Find the solutions, find the options. And when you go to your sponsor, you should go to your sponsor with the options to pick from A, B, C of what the solution is. But communicating those, make sure that you are really at heart kind of drilling down on what you want. So for me, applying those consistent methodologies in a way that it almost became intuitive. And you can almost say, you know what, it's not sincere. It almost becomes, no, it gets to a point where it's embedded in you. You naturally ask the question after you've said something. You test people. You hold a meeting, and then you follow up the meeting with emails and questions, just to begin to get a sense for how responsive they are, how open they are. I don't wait to find out that there's going to be a problem in the communication. I'm constantly testing the communication, even with people where I would assume we understood each other. And even then, there's things that I know I don't know, and they're going to happen. But try to own it and get ahead of it. So own the responsibility for the entire communication process, and continuously reevaluate and test those assumptions. So understand that the behaviors that you're receiving are driven by underlying values and assumptions and beliefs. And the more that you try to test ahead of time, what are those assumptions? So when you're dealing with a different culture, or when you're dealing with a different language or a different, race, try to have conversations around those assumptions, around testing those assumptions, so that you don't have to wait for those assumptions and those beliefs to be in absolute conflict with yours to realize there's a huge problem. And I'll give you an example. I had a client in Peru, and I'm a very direct person. If I don't agree with something, I say I don't agree with something. At the time, I'd been working with a client from Holland, very direct culture. If they don't like it, they tell you they don't like it. Negotiating is kind of like, here are the cards on the table. Let's move them around together and see how we can work together. And I know Latin cultures are more like, here are my cards, and now, let's negotiate, and I'll try to lower your price. So very, very different styles. But this was a client that I'd worked with several years before, and several years before I had let them know in the nicest way possible that what they were trying to do wasn't going to work. It was a forecasting implementation, and they had really bad data. So I present a problem and I give solutions. What is going to work is the process element of it. You can streamline your processes. You can begin to get people trained on what forecasting is. You can automate some of these things through this tool. But the forecasting itself, you will not be able to rely on because the data is that bad. Can we do net forecasting? Well, in some cases, netting it out helps because, some of the positives net out some of the negatives. But again, unreliable. So I said, but you can work on this, and at a later time when you're ready to make the investment, which usually means when you're ready to see what I'm telling you and you realize that it's costing you more money to keep working off bad data, you'll come back. And so sure enough, 2 years later, they came back and they were like, Karen, we're having one of the big firms come in and help us clean up our data. So I think we're ready for you to come back and help us. And so I said, great, I'll go back and help you. First week on the job, I get the top VPs of the company, and they come in a group and they approach me and they're like, Karen, we're having some problems with the data. And so we were just wondering, are you sure it's not going to work if we don't fix the data right now? And I smiled at them, and I was like, it's not going to work. And I had the same conversation that I had three years ago. We can work on this, we can work on that. This is going to help, and that's going to help, and these are the benefits of still moving forward. It's still progress, but nothing's going to change the fact that you have bad data. Well, I kid you not, every 2 days those executives would come, and they would ask me the same question. And after every conversation, they would smile and they would say, yeah, we understand, and they would walk away. And a couple of them were Asian. And so I thought, okay, maybe they don't like confrontation, and so they're hoping that the next time they catch me in a different mood or a better mood, or I don't know, and I'll say, yeah, it's going to work. But every 3 days I was having the same conversation, and literally by the end of the second week, they would come and look for me, and they would say, Karen, and I would be like, same conversation? They're like, yeah. I'm like, same answer. And I would just laugh. And so I've learned, I'm really direct. What I've had to learn is to soften the approach, so I'll kind of laugh about it and just kind of smile. When really, you could say my German side would be outraged. Don't waste my time. I've given you the answer 10 times. It's the same answer, right? And you had the answer 10 years, and now, 3 years ago, and how many more dollars later? And I'm like, just laugh it off. It's the same answer. And that goes a little bit as to know what you stand for. Did I have bosses at the time telling me, hey, Karen, just tell them that it's going to be okay? Sure. And what was my response? Why don't you tell them that? Because you're my boss. I'm sure it has a lot more credibility if it comes from you, because actually you're higher up in the company. But I'm not going to tell them that. There's a reason why afterwards clients, and I'm sure next time a product opens up, they're like, we want you as our project manager. It's a new product. She doesn't know anything about it. We don't care. We want to work with her. So at the end of the day, you have to know what you stand for. Because if everything around you is moving and you're trying to communicate, you're trying to cross a bridge, you're trying to get from point A to point B through change, you're trying to get from point A from point B, and that I'm one person and you're a different person and we're completely different universes. Well, if I keep moving, you know, in what I stand for, and you're trying to do the same thing, you're trying to get and connect with me, then we're much more likely to miss each other. And I think that often happens when we're dealing with people from other cultures. We're trying so hard to emulate them and please them that we lose focus on who we are and what we stand for. So you really have to get down and honest with yourself about what are those things that you can be flexible about, because you do have to understand, what can I flex? So I kind of say, understand your core, understand your product as a person, and then be as flexible as you can with the packaging. So try to convey that core in every way, shape, or form, and understand the simpler the better. But at the same time, you got to know what you stand for at the end of the day. So optimal use of yourself as a resource. Doesn't matter what culture that you're addressing. If you follow the humble approach of, I'm not going to make an assumption that I know more than you. I'm not going to make an assumption that I know your culture because of your country or because of your gender or even because of your age. I am going to do my research. I am going to do, you know, my assessment, my due diligence, because whatever I can know, I will know, and I will place, you know, with that word of caution that I'm not going to stereotype, and I'm not going to, you know, fall by just having those assumptions and taking them to be true. But then I'm really going to make an effort to get to know you and to consistently test whether I really know and understand you and whether you're really knowing and understanding me. And as you do that, just continuously build your capacity to learn. The faster that you can learn, the faster that you can adapt to what that other circumstance around you is demanding of you, then, you know, the less of a toll it will take on you, because this is actually devastating. I mean, it's a devastating experience to go through. It's so draining. How many of you go on vacation and you feel tired when you come back from vacation? Because our bodies are in hyper mode. We're in a different location and our bodies are just absorbing. How many of you, when you go deal with a different department, you come back from a meeting and you're just absorbed, you know, you're just drained. So our bodies are constantly picking up, and that's a very draining process. The more you do it and the better that you get at the learning itself, then the less draining it will be, the more intuitive it will be, and the more that you will be able to just focus on, you know, kind of the substance of the project itself without this being a barrier to it. And you heard me say kind of mastery is in simplicity. So we have a few minutes. We do have time to go ahead. Oh, and know yourself. Just to prove the point, I mean, this is really hard. I'm extremely direct, and I've come to realize at this point in my life, I think it's not just core and values and beliefs, because it's almost like in the perfect world, we want it all, right? We want fairness, and we want honesty, and we want loyalty, and we want, and in fact, I had a client recently going through organizational change. And part of the reason why they were having such hard time in changing was because they felt in conflict with a lot of those values. And their values were loyalty, were trustworthiness, loyalty. And the hard thing is when push comes to shove, so lay them all on the table, but when push comes to shove, try to rank them. And I mean really know yourself, because that's the anchor when you deal with other people. This, to me, even I read it, and it probably shows that I'm becoming a softie, but I read it, and it's a really, to me, it's a really strong quote. I almost have begun to be more accommodating to the fact that we lie, we white lie, we small lie, we manipulate, whatever it may be. But I mean, since I can remember, I've lived by the notion that lying to somebody is a disrespect to myself. And that somebody lying to me is a disrespect to me, and them arrogantly trying to manipulate my reality to where I don't have ownership of the choices that I make within my real world. So this is how, you know, this is probably my core. And yet, you know, I face clients every day that tell me, yeah, I understand, perfectly agree, I absolutely agree. It'll be done tomorrow, right? Teammates, right? Employees. You're like, you're literally, you know, here's the draft. Will you send this email out? You know, because you should have already drafted the document yourself, but you haven't. And, you know, push them. So here it, absolutely, I'll do it right now. And it doesn't happen, right? Okay, I'm not the only one. And I'm just like, I'm fuming. I am fuming. But I've learned to realize I stand for that. It doesn't mean that other people stand for that. In fact, and it's not because they don't value this, but when push comes to shove, they have different priorities and values. And I'll give you one that I think relates: conflict. I will go to fight for the truth. And I grew up in a culture, German and British. I'm very argumentative, so I love to debate. So I'm like, let's go for it. Because I'm arguing my truth. I don't even believe it's the universal truth. But I'll defend it. And I'll even, if you're already defending your side of it, then I'll defend a different opinion so that together we'll try to find the best possible answer. So when someone doesn't engage with me in conversation and dialogue, to me that's a lack of respect. You know, again, how are we wired? Well, there's many cultures out there that would rather not engage in conversation than go through any type of conflictive experience, right? I mean, and even people around us of our same culture avoid confrontation. Even one of my bosses that got me hooked on all this Ayn Rand stuff that you see me putting would say, Karen, you know what? You don't even stand for anything, so go figure yourself out and come back. And I'd be like, what do you mean I don't stand for anything? Just because I think that, you know, under the right circumstances, there is an argument to be made in every direction. He's like, no, you don't stand for anything, and you are non-confrontational. And I'd be like, oh my God, I wish I could carry you around so that you could say I'm non-confrontational. So it's all in perspective, and next to him, I certainly wasn't confrontational, because I've really learned to change the packaging. So I've tried to address it through humor, or I've tried to address it through sweetness, or I've tried to, you know, being a woman too, you know, and having a very direct approach in different cultures. It's not necessarily well received, but I can't go against who I am. So I've had to find a way to package it in a manner. This is just a very personal example to me. You know, the homework is on you to figure yourself out. Let's go ahead and get into groups of, so every row we're going to divide it in half, and we're going to do a really quick exercise so that we can close by sharing those thoughts. To me, like I said, a really valuable part of attending these meetings was getting to talk to the people in the audience around me. So I encourage you to utilize that time and you know, connect with one or two people in the least. And go ahead and amongst yourselves, just share a couple of stories and use the one that you pick to answer one or the other. Either what were the assumptions that you think were taking place that drove for this to be a challenge of the magnitude that it ended up being, or if it's easier, what would you have done different? We good? So just every row divided in two, and we'll take 10 minutes just to end with our conclusions. So let's start with you guys over here.
Yeah. Okay. So we were relating about our experience working in a globally diverse team. And when I used the context of working in technology on an offshore team from India, as well as Mexico, and especially more so in the Indian culture, what we were joking to really understand. You have to really frame your questioning, being the American or German cultures who are very masculine and very, very task-centered versus the Indian culture, the Scandinavian cultures, French culture, very, very more feminine type culture, you know, trying to please and to you know, be friendly with you. And so we were talking about how, for example, if you don't phrase things correctly, if you ask somebody in one of your feminine cultures a direct question, they don't want to offend you. So even if it's not the truth, they're going to tell you what they think you want to hear, as opposed to the truth.
Right.
Because they don't want to offend you.
So what's the assumption there?
Well, the assumption is you have to be. The assumption we're assuming that everybody else thinks like we do, and that's not the case. Masculine versus feminine cultures. So
Right.
therefore, you have to be in tune to that and realize that the differences in the cultures.
And for the feminine culture, what's the assumption related to a direct response? What's the association? A direct response or a direct question they associate with?
Authority, authoritarian.
With, right, imposing arrogance or questioning or, okay. So that's a great example. And did you guys answer that, or what would you have done different?
It was more of a learning experiences. In fact, previous employer, they actually had a diversity, a cultural diversity awareness, where I actually, it made me understand better that that's really what the dynamics are happening within the different cultures.
Yeah. So in the context of, how do I test those assumptions on an ongoing basis, when I get fluffy answers now from clients, I ask them. And and when I ask direct questions, I kind of premise them by, it may sound direct to you, and I guess from my background, I'm used to being really direct. So I'm not questioning your authority at all, or it's not at all an assumption or a questioning of what you're doing. I would just like to know. So I've kind of bridged the in between, because by premising the direct question, I'm already now being feminine in my approach. Do you see what I mean? But I managed to, by that way, be true to myself and say, but I'm just going to go out and ask you. Of course, people that are very isolated in their culture that is very masculine are not even aware that they might be able to premise it and say, I don't mean to insult you when I ask you, why didn't you get the job done?
As opposed to
right?
being assumed that you're not doing as you're told.
Right, and I use that example because that question is a really strong question to ask. I mean, why didn't you do it? Because at the end of the day, my perspective, there's no excuse, right? That's already the presumption. So I'm kind of saying I don't mean to insult you, but if it was asked to me, it is a direct hit, right? And it's not like, well, are you okay? Were you sick? It's like, no, why didn't you do it? Okay, let's go to the next group.
I worked in a company where there was a project manager, and he was getting ready to implement a server change or something, and he needed equipment ordered. And the procurement manager ordered this equipment with the SAP application and that. So when the project came and everybody was together and getting ready to do their task and jobs to get this done, there was no equipment. So I came in on a risk remediation project. So when I saw that, the project manager said, it keeps happening, it never stops. So I said, well, why don't we have the procurement manager go into the change management application of something and put in there as to whether he's received that equipment or not. And that pretty much resolved.
Right. So I'm not going to assume that you received it. I want to hear feedback and confirmation that you received it. That's owning the entire communication process. Next team.
Oh, yeah, we talked a little bit about a couple different scenarios, but one with my work is last year we had a company, a foreign company that we're dealing with. Okay, we're in sales, so to win the bid in the business, we had to get the requirements, and so trying to understand what the customer requirement was is kind of an issue because it's a different language and different culture, and also our folks and within our group just secondhand translating from person to person, and also getting the expectation right on price and on technology that they needed. So we're dealing with them again. So we're trying to make sure we don't make the same mistake as last year.
Sounds like
So what are the lessons learned now that you are getting to do it over?
Well, some of the suggestions here was we have like a document so that when we go to a visit that we take the documentation with us and fill in the blanks kind of thing, and maybe another feedback loop with them. I just ran into this recently that since we have things kind of secondhand from person to person as to what the customer actually said, to actually maybe, for myself to go back to the customer and clarify.
Definitely, I can definitely attest to the sooner in the process that you get involved, even during the sales process as a project manager, right? The better off you are, because you're the one that's going to have to deliver, so you can set those expectations, you can begin to build that relationship. And when there's different languages, the more that you can take the emphasis away from the actual written or spoken language, and sometimes it's a barrier because of the distance, but if you can interact to where you can visually show each other on software, you sometimes realize that what you were talking about was not at all what you thought you were talking about with the other person. Guys in the back? Guys, I'm not sure.
I guess one of the things we talked about was looking at the customer coming to you with a preset schedule, along with the assumptions that the resources will be available, and expect that as project manager and it will just buy into it because of who he is and his effective knowledge, as opposed to recognizing what reality really is. And so essentially the mission is there is to want to ensure that the project team is on board with the realities as opposed to the assumptions of magical thinking that's being expressed. And also then fact mind to then go back to the customer and realize, to recognize, I have them recognize that, where the difficulties are, respectively, what a more realistic schedule will be.
It's interesting, some assumptions are it doesn't make them any easier to deal with, but are at least very visible, like things to do with scheduling. Everybody wants it done yesterday, and you're like, hello. And then there's some underlined, much more difficult to even know are there assumptions, like when you're putting specs together for a customer and understanding what they're asking for is what you're understanding they're asking for. And sometimes it even gets as complicated as speed, They want something fast. Well, what does fast mean to them? Or quick. Well, what does quick? Or user-friendly. What does user-friendly mean to them? 1 click or 10 clicks? And how much are they willing to pay for every click that they avoid? Right? Because there's the cost element to it. So definitely great examples there.
Who's next? Guys, will you with me? Ours is about a speaking seminar or event on diversity, which the panel participation, she left, she was telling us about it. Hardly anybody showed up to it. It could be some of the reasons for that is it wasn't advertised enough for the right locations. Not enough people knew about it.
Right. So again, owning that communication channel, not just because I put it out there. I mean, do you guys notice to come here you asked to RSVP? And of course, we want to do that because we want our parking permit, but it also lets the event planners know, who's coming and what the numbers look like. Yeah.
Yeah. We discussed 3 sets of places where we saw assumptions that people in the team or people managing the team made that broke it up. One of the situations was people who were using exactly the same tools and use exactly the same words, but with a different context. And in this case, it was a little Raytheon thing for that one that was system engineers versus IT people. And we put you have people on the same team. And all system engineers figure the contract is the specs. It doesn't matter, that's the end. All the IT people think it's a nice suggestion sheet and we're going to have to own it for 30 years. And then we looked at another one that was exactly the same distinction and assumption set, but it was in a company that made machinery to deliver, and then they had another part of the company that made machinery that they would deliver as a public-private cooperation, and then run it for 30 years. Yeah. And one of our people moved from deliver it, so their behavior is like the systems engineers, to the deliver it and operate it. And that behavior is very much like the guys in IT who expect to own it for 30 years. We had another situation where somebody generated a government contract. They negotiated with a company in Germany, did all the negotiations with Germany, they can bid, and their assumption is these are the guys who are going to build it. that was not the case. As soon as they got it all negotiated, the German company decided to move all of the manufacturing to Michigan, and you had a whole new set of people with different assumptions, different understanding of what the specs meant. None of the docs worked. And so part of that was to get all of that in initially. And first said it was to understand that you're going to have that and kind of get a common base of why you're doing it, to establish a common assumption set. In the case of manufacturing and your contracting, they went back and worked with the company to make sure that people understood what was on the line and to go get the conversation, the belief in line, get the assumption sets in line so they could produce and deliver government product.
So as you can see, I mean, assumptions are just everywhere, regardless of language. You can be in the same company, you can be, and we just make assumptions. We have to survive. I mean, it's a given, right? We make assumptions about our world. We act in the belief that things are going to be as we have seen them and our experience has taught us. The more that we broaden our horizon, the more important it becomes for us to constantly test those assumptions. In consulting, you're often told to ask 5 questions to try to get to the bottom of, you know, but what exactly do you mean? Get to the real whys. I apologize because we are, you know, running over time. So if anybody needs to leave, I will not be insulted by that. I want to acknowledge the fact that, you know, time is important. I do also want to give the opportunity for those that do wish to stay to hear. I think we have 2 or 3 other groups just to talk about their examples, and you know, then that's kind of it for me. So who are we missing? The group up front.
So we have an example where there's a project without really resources or budget assigned yet. The boss wanted me to do as much as we could without the official targets and the resources in the budget. And so fast forward to, this was last year, fast forward to this year where we're getting to a point where we have to assign these different things, and I find out today that he was testing all along for me to come up with a real reason to go do this, and to, you know, here's what it's going to take, all of those different things which I've been seeing in the business thesis. But I didn't realize he was testing me, and we worked together for 6 months. So the assumption was, you know, I was waiting for him to make the call because he was the one for assignment, resources, budget, all those things. But in reality, he was waiting for me to step forward and really convince them that this is what we need to go off and do.
Right.
And so, so what I would have done differently is just really had a conversation. Well, this is not moving. It's not moving. Let's talk about, you know, what needs to happen here. I'm giving you this bits and pieces of information. Is it not enough? And maybe the 5 whys.
Right.
I could learn from that.
Well, and after 6 years working together, I mean, it's really just, you cannot take anything for granted. You can't wait for things not to happen. You constantly have to be testing. Did you receive my message? You know, and are we on the same page before the reality lets you know otherwise? And then, yeah.
Ours was very much in line with what there was in the back about, we're in the industry of where our team is kind of subdivided into the planners and the implementers.
Mm-hmm.
So we're on the implementation side, and the planners have come forward and made assumptions that we can do certain things. And so ours isn't really cultural diversity, but just a team diversity of managing expectations and coming in and saying, without throwing someone else under the bus, or, you know, causing battle of, this is what we know needs to happen, and this is a realistic time frame.
Right.
So that is the biggest struggle that we deal with.
So for me, I've learned through my career to know when to escalate things. And when needed, I'll use the client to escalate things. If I'm not in a position to escalate it internally myself, I build a good enough relationship with the client where I can say, you know, this might have a stronger impact coming from you, or this might get further or taken care of faster if it came from you than if it came from me. Because again, that's my Latin background. I will hustle. Unfortunately, a lot of companies wait for projects to fail over and over again to realize that their sales team or their planning team really should be including somebody from the implementation in the planning process to make sure that they're realistically planning something that's doable. My encouragement and my challenge to you would be to be proactive and make sure that whoever is in a position to care about the successful, whole, is aware that it is in their best interest to include you in that planning process as a stakeholder. Not because you are the sales expert or the planning expert, but because you can ask questions and bring light to things that they otherwise wouldn't. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I left my conclusions on purpose to kind of nip time. I can't emphasize more how important it is for you to take ownership of the entire process. And
I just want to make a last comment regarding the assumptions and kind of the variety of dialogues that we have in Spanish. Because this happened to me this morning. Just working with my client, they are trying to, they're in the plumbing industry, so as you can imagine, they deal with Home Depot, Lowe's, and they go to Mexico. They have different stores in Mexico. So they are coming up with this new product, and of course, they have to make the instruction sheets in Spanish. So when I was reading the instruction sheet, I couldn't really understand it. Because the thing is, it was really Spanish, but it was probably made about a person from Mexico, because it was really understood by somebody from Mexico, but me as a South American, I couldn't really understand it. So just kind of keep that in mind when you try to have a strategy and really put it in practice in a Latin culture, especially a Spanish speaker, because I cannot really find a language that has as many dialects as the Spanish has.
Thanks, everybody.
Karen, thank you very much.